Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 25 of my game system series. In this video I'll be covering the sequence of play game system. This is my third update of this video, which includes corrections and updated content and improved images. The primary changes are more pictures and more clarity on some of the concepts being covered concerning the game system game mechanic. In this video, I'll be attempting to determine the optimal sequence of play, or rules for the creation of a sequence of play, for use for Micro Armor figure gaming rules. While this video is mainly focused on Micro Armor, basically World War II, Cold War and modern gaming, the basic principles apply to any period. It goes without saying that an aircraft phase may not be applicable to ancients or even Napoleonic gaming, but I suspect most gamers will understand this. Let's start with the definition of a sequence of play. A sequence of play is a regimented structure of activities. Each player needs to perform a range of activities in a game turn, and these activities for both players are placed into a linear structure which represents the sequence of play. The linear structure is normally broken up into separate segments or phases, with a player required to complete all allowed activities in a given phase or stage before moving on to the next phase or stage. More complex sequence of plays include activity triggers, where an activity is permitted only when a specific trigger is tripped by the opposing phasing player. These more complex concepts will be covered later. For now, we'll only cover simple phases where only a single player conducts activity in a given phase, or both players conduct simple non-trigger activities simultaneously. What I'll be doing now is try to identify the general activities a player needs to conduct in a given game turn at a very high level. This can be basically broken into 4 basic activity groupings. That is pre-activity, movement activity, fire or combat activities, and post-activities. Pre-activities, or those activities which are conducted before players actually move and have fire combat, are those which are typically associated with command, reinforcement and supply. They are required to be conducted before any movement or fire combat is conducted in a given game turn. For example, before you can conduct fire combat, you will need to know or may need to know your supply status, which can affect that fire combat. Another common activity is command control, particularly if it's determined in a random manner. Before you actually move your figures, you need to know what level of command control those elements have. Post activities are those which concern themselves with housekeeping or supplementary effects of movement and fire combat. Events which occur in a game may trigger morale effects, such as, when heavy losses occur in a given game turn. This could cause your element to become disordered or routed. Many routing and rally activities will occur in the post-activity stage. Advancing the game turn record marker or determining if an army is demoralized or panics will often occur in this stage. Now we'll move on to the meat of the sequence of play, starting with movement. Movement activities allow a player to move all his or her elements. Fire and combat activities allow a player to conduct fire combat or other combat functions. These 2 stages represent the core of any sequence of play, or for that matter, a game. This basic structure can be expanded and the number of activities or phases expanded accordingly. For example, it is common to have a separate close combat or close assault phase, which is separate from a fire combat phase. Squad scale games can include a host of activities which are designed to simulate simultaneous movement, such as multiple movement and combat sub-activities, each of which occur in a different manner, such as fire move or move fire, or different combinations of these activities. I'll only be covering the basic structure, and game designers will need to embellish this basic sequence of play as required. Now that we've identified the activities each player is expected to conduct at a high level, we need to create an expanded structure to account for both players executing these activities together, which completes the entire game turn structure. In simple terms, when and how does each player execute their expected activities in relation to each other? The most simple and basic sequence of play structure is the I go, you go sequence of play. Literally, one player conducts his or her activities, and when complete, the opposing player does so as well. This sequence of play is the most basic, and a classic example is chess, where white moves followed by black. For figure gaming, the sequence of play can be more complex, but in principle, each player conducts all their allowed activity in a player stage, which is then followed by the next player. While the I go, you go sequence of play is simple, there is a large amount of wasted time inherent in this sequence of play. One player conducts an activity which does not impact the other player, yet the other player has to wait around until his opponent has completed that function, twiddling his thumbs or her thumbs. Examples could be determined supply states, command control, or army demoralization. It would be more efficient if both players conduct these activities together, if applicable to the game system. We can achieve this by mixing simultaneous and sequential phases together in our sequence of play. In the example shown here, we've identified the phases which could be conducted simultaneously, mainly because the activity in that phase does not affect the opposing player. In this case, it is quicker to allow both players to conduct these activities at the same time. In some cases, some activities will affect subsequent movement and fire order. For example, an initiative activity could determine player order. This would require some record keeping. The sequential player phases would contain the movement and combat activities only. It is this division between simultaneous activities and sequential activities which encourages a sequence of play to conduct a pre- and post-activity stage. That is, you can quarantine the simultaneous activities in your pre- and post-activity stages, allowing the sequential activities to occur in the movement combat phases accordingly. An even more complex sequence of play would combine the two player phases into a form of alternate subphases, with one player moving and conducting combat with only a part of his or her force, followed by the other player. This continues until all the player's elements have been moved. All these sequence of play systems have their benefit and disadvantages. It is up to the designer to determine which sequence of play best suits the rules that they are designing. There are always some housekeeping activities which occur before movement and fire combat occurs. The most common is initiative determination, which is used to affect the order of the following phases or the order within the phases. Other functions are command control and supply, such as determining what is in command or what is in supply and what is not. Orders could also be defined, changed, or enacted in such a pre-housekeeping phase. What occurs in this phase is normally the boring stuff, so every effort should be made to make it as quick and simple as possible to execute. The final phase is a post-housekeeping phase, such as special morale tests, rally, removal of markers, etc. The final function could be advancing the turn record chart by one game turn. Depending on the victory conditions used, players could determine victory points achieved during the housekeeping phase as well to see if someone's won. Overall, army morale could also be determined, so if casualties reach a certain point, the whole force mix on the playing area becomes exhausted or demoralised, reducing their ability to attack or move. Reinforcements could alter this state, but these would arrive at the start of the following game turn, and forces on the playing area would remain demoralised while only the reinforcements are unaffected. For example, rules designers could implement whatever system they feel represents reality and gives you a good playable game. But always remember the KISS principle. Keep it simple at all costs. Another area to look at is combat functions which need to be executed sequentially or could be executed simultaneously. Classic example is area fire, which is normally pre-planned, and counter battery fire, which normally does not affect the activities on the playing area and are best dealt with separately. All these functions can be executed within a standard combat phase, but in order to reduce the player load during these phases, these activities could be moved to special phases. Other examples are aircraft, especially if air-to-air combat occurs. If there is no air-to-air combat, this could also be merged in with the standard movement and combat phases, but are often separated in order to reduce the load on players when they do conduct these phases. Some activities can have additional effects on morale, supply and command control, such as what may occur with NBC attacks. In this case, they may well be may well be a special test against each element to determine if it's eliminated or otherwise affected. This could be placed in the post-housekeeping phase. These are examples of activities which can be executed simultaneously and do not rely on any activity occurring on the playing area, and as a result can be separated from the core sequence of play of any game system. The I go, you go sequence of play is simple and has many advantages, but in many cases it could be too simple. As a result, this sequence of play may require a special close assault phase in order to simulate a defensive fire as the attacking element closes with the enemy. This is an example of a trigger event, which is best placed into separate phases which only need to be considered when those specific combats occur. During this close assault phase, a player moves, is fired upon, and may fire back. The close assault phase could be complex, but it's quarantined from the rest of the sequence of play, so it does not impact gameplay if these activities do not occur in the game turn. The other issue with a I go, you go sequence of play is fire combat is not simultaneous, unless special return fire rules are included. If this type of fire combat is required, special rules or phases may need to be included. Many rules have two fire phases where elements can conduct fire. One is in its own player turn and one is in the enemy player turn. Elements could fire in both phases or could be restricted to only one phase. The latter requires record keeping, which is bad, but based on the game system may be unavoidable. While these factors are disadvantages, this type of sequence of play is easy to learn and simple to execute, so remains very popular and does dramatically enhance game play. We'll now look at another sequence of play structure, the I move, you move, and we both fire sequence of play. This means a player moves, followed by the opposing player moving as well. When all movement is complete, both players conduct fire combat or close combat simultaneously. The I move, you move, and we both fire sequence of play is also simple and now allows for simultaneous fire combat, but makes player order more critical. The order of movement could be more detailed, with players alternating the movement of multi-element formations. This would overcome the advantages and disadvantages of being the first or second player. You still have the close assault issue, which still needs to be in a separate phase. One variation of the I move, you move, and we both fire sequence of play, which overcomes the movement order issue, is there is only one movement phase. Each player moves part of their entire force mix, followed by the other player moving only a part of his entire force mix. This is repeated until all elements for both players have been moved. After all movement or during movement, both players conduct fire combat. Another option is the I move and fire and you move and fire sequence of play. This means a player conducts both movement and combat in a single phase, followed by the opposing player. This is not a structure alternative, but merges two activities into a single activity, that is movement and fire combat. There is no separate movement or combat phases. Instead, there is a single phase where elements conduct movement and fire combat together. This is basically an adaptation or another version of the I move and you move sequence of play structure. In the I move and fire and you move and fire combined activity, each player conducts movement and fire combat in the same phase. One method of achieving this is requiring the expenditure of an element's movement allowance to conduct fire combat. You can retain the core I go, you go system, or a more complex alternate system that you may select where both players alternate the movement of parts of their force. The only difference is there is only a single movement and combat phase where both players conduct both movement and combat together. This system is clean, but the rules have to be carefully crafted to cover all the unusual situations which may occur as a result. This system or structure could overcome the requirement of a separate close assault phase. The issue is you would require opportunity fire and or return fire rules, although opportunity fire would always be required before a close assault regardless, so you're always going to have it in there. It's just that you may need to add rules such as return fire rules, which add complexity. This general style of sequence of play is becoming more popular because it overcomes a major problem with the previous simpler systems. When you separate movement and fire combat, the game can quickly become a move to the best fire position and fire all your weapons type game. When you combine movement and fire combat, the game becomes focused on taking objectives with a combination of movement, fire combat and close assault. However, as indicated earlier, this system is more complex and that needs to be considered. This does bring up a critical factor or interesting factor. Often the simpler sequence of play structures are easier to write rules for, while the complex merged sequence of play systems or structures require more rules to explain and cover all the exceptions. This is a game designer decision that all rules writer need to carefully consider. I'm certain there are other sequence of play structures, but most of the rules I've seen uses one of the following three basic sequence of play structures. I go, you go. I move, you move, and we both fire. I move and fire, and you move and fire. And of course you can have different combinations of all this as well. When selecting a sequence of play, it's important to remember one of the key objectives of a sequence of play is game flow, or maintaining a game flow. You need a sequence of play which encourages seamless game flow. For example, being forced to reference back to the sequence of play to determine what the next phase is will break game flow. This can happen when there are too many phases and players cannot memorize them all. Trying to work out what is possible in a phase also breaks game flow. This can happen when the phase includes too much unrelated activity. Another key objective is to ensure both players are involved as much as possible in each phase, phasing or non. With combat phases, this is simple, but administration phases can break the game flow of the opposing player, so that player has nothing to do during that phase if it's sequential. You can't go overboard with this, as some downtime for a player during a sequence of play is necessary, but the last thing you want is the other player falling asleep as you track supply and supply points. There are also a number of basic rules for constructing a sequence of play. The names of each phase should be obvious and logical, so an artillery phase is short, clear and concise, while a remote influence phase less so. The phases should be as self-contained as possible. If a player has to remember something from a previous phase in a subsequent phase, it introduces complexity and requires counters and record keeping. You need to try and keep the number of phases as few as possible. This does not mean a phase cannot be complex, but try and keep the total number of main phases down to a minimal number. Trying to keep track of 20 separate phases each game turns will exhaust your players and potentially confuse them, as well as being impossible to memorize. Finally, if your game system is simple, pick a simple sequence of play. If you want more nuance, then ramp up to a more complex sequence of play. What I'm showing you here is a suggested basic sequence of play. It must be pointed out this is purely my preference and I'm not suggesting this is superior to any other sequence of play structures. This does allow as much simultaneous activity to be taken out of the core phases as possible, allowing for a flexible and innovative primary core phases. This would not be used for a very simple abstract game. The first phase is the command phase, where initiative, command control, supply, weather and reinforcements are determined. The artillery phase contains all artillery activity which is not direct fire support, such as area fire, interdiction fire and counter battery fire. Prior to World War I, this phase would probably be ignored, although some indirect fire did occur in the American Civil War period and Napoleonic period as well. The aircraft phase contains all aircraft activity, air-to-air, ground-to-air, air-to-ground activity. Prior to World War I, there were no aircraft, unless you wish to include observation balloons, so you need not concern yourself with this phase if you're designing ancient, Napoleonic or American Civil War game. During the player fire and movement phase, both players conduct movement and fire combat, using whatever system you have decided upon. My preference is a combined movement and fire combat system, with the order determined by initiative and possibly allowing for a player to conduct fire and movement for a part of his force, followed by the opposing player's part of his force, and this is repeated until all the forces have completed their movement and fire combat. Finally, we come to the housekeeping phase, where rally, route, repair, removal of markers and aircraft and the advancement of turn record marker occurs. A final, very important rule. Before adding a phase, rule or stage, you need to ask yourself, what is the problem that is being solved by doing this? If the answer is, I don't know, or I think it'll be interesting, then don't add it. Designers always have the urge to add innovative ideas for the sake of adding innovative ideas. If it solves a problem, then it's a good idea, but otherwise always obey the KISS principle. Keep it simple at all costs. While my suggested sequence of play gives you an interesting game, these days I use a very simple set of rules to encourage players or new players to enter the hobby, and they all use the I go, you go sequence of play, and I have to admit it works fine. This is especially the case if the scale of your game is very high level. Probably would not work so well if you were basically at a low level squad or platoon level game, but if you're attempting to reproduce a fairly large conflict, look, I go, you go, simple game system works quite well, and that allows players to focus on where to send their forces rather than worrying about 20 different phases, etc. Actually, most of my gaming these days uses the simple I go, you go system. As I indicated before, this is because I'm trying to bring new gamers into the hobby. But the other reason, which is equally as important, is I flip between rules quite a bit. So a complex sequence of play represents too much friction. I keep on forgetting things if the rules are too complex, and complex rules typically have complex sequence of plays. Personal preference may not be the optimal preference in retrospect. So while I do like my more complex sequence of play, it may not be optimal. I'll leave that up to the individual game designers. And so this concludes episode 25 of my presentation on micro armor game system design, which in this case covers sequence of play. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.